This presentation will provide an overview of the U.S. marketing applications for medical devices. Since Omnyx is a medical device manufacturer, there are certain FDA clearances or approvals we must receive before we can place a medical device on the market. So our agenda is to first review the different medical device classes, then we will review the pre-submission meetings, such as what they are and how do we use them. Then we'll go over the pre-market notification process and discuss substantial equivalence in the various 510(k) submissions. Then we will conclude with an overview of the pre-market approval or PMA process. Step 2. So it's a medical device. What is the device's classification? This is determined by three main things. The intended use, which is the objective intent of the persons legally responsible for the labeling of the device risk, and the indications for use, which identify the specific target population. So classification is determined from these items, which then identifies the level of regulatory control that is necessary to assure the safety and effectiveness of the device, and the process to bring the device to market. So when a company decides to manufacture a medical device, in terms of impact to U.S. regulatory agencies, the company should first assess the following. Step 1, is this thing a medical device? If the answer is yes, you'll proceed to Step 2. And Step 2 is, what is the device's classification? And the answer to this question will guide Step 3. And Step 3 is, what do I need to submit to FDA for review? And we'll get into more detail on the answers to these questions in the following slides. So Step 1, is this thing a medical device? The FD&C Act defines a medical device as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component, part, or accessory, which is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action. For the different class levels, we have Class 1, which adhere to general controls, and I will get into this in a later slide. And these are the lowest risk devices, which are typically exempt from submission requirements. And Class 2, which adhere to general controls and special controls. And these are the medium risk devices, which typically require a 510(k) submission. And Class 3, which must adhere to general controls and pre-market approval. And these are the highest risk devices that typically require a pre-market approval. And as the device risk increases, class level increases, and regulatory controls increase. So more specifically, for the Omnyx IDP classification, this is determined by 21 CFR Part 864, Hematology and Pathology Devices, Subpart B, Section 864, IHC Reagents and Kits. And in this section, Class 1 devices are defined as devices that provide pathologists with adjunctive diagnostic information that may be included in a clinical report. Class 2 are intended for the detection and/or measurement of certain target analytes to provide prognosis or predictive data, and Class 3 are any intended use not described above. So we have a 510(k) for the VL4 scanner, and are preparing a 510(k) PMA for the VL120 scanner. So why do we require different submissions for one device? It all comes down to the manufacturer's intended use. So for the 510(k) device, our intended use is limited to the manual read of HER2. For the PMA device, our intended use expands to primary diagnostic use. So for Class 1 devices, they are exempt from an FDA submission, but require establishment registration, adherence to the quality system regulation, a medical device listing with FDA, medical device reporting requirements, and labeling per 21 CFR 801 and 809. And as I mentioned previously, most of these are exempt from 510(k) requirements. Some examples of Class 1 devices include tongue depressors, ACE bandages, and medical gloves. For Class 2 medical devices, you require additional post-market surveillance, human clinical data, special labeling, and performance standards and testing data. And these Class 2 devices require a 510(k) submission of data for review prior to marketing. Some examples of Class 2 devices include infusion pumps, wheelchairs, and the VL4 scanner as part of the manual read of the digital HER2 application. For Class 3 devices, pretty much everything is required. So we have all the requirements for Class 2 devices, plus critical supplier review, more human clinical data, panel review, a manufacturing report, a sample of promotional material, inspections, and requires the submission of a PMA for scientific review and FDA approval of the medical device. And some examples of Class 3 devices include a heart valve, defibrillators, and the Omnyx IDP system for primary diagnostic use. So finally, to Step 3, for the FDA submission type. We have three options: pre-submissions, 510(k) submissions, and PMA submissions. So a pre-submission meeting is a formal method of obtaining feedback from FDA regarding an FDA submission or content to be included in an FDA submission, such as a clinical study report. And we have engaged FDA recently in a pre-submission meeting about the 510K submission for the VL120 scanner for the Omnyx manual read of the digital HER2 application. We also plan to include FDA in a pre-submission meeting to discuss the usability study for the PMA device. And the benefits of pre-submissions include early collaboration with FDA, which speeds FDA review, results in less deficiency letters, or requests for additional information. So for a 510K submission, what does the 510K mean? It is from Section 510K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. For a 510K submission, you must first define a predicate device, then demonstrate substantial equivalence to the predicate to show that your device is as safe and effective as the predicate device. In the 510K submission, you do this by showing that devices have the same intended use and either the same technology or a different technology, but you're able to provide clinical or scientific data to show that the device is as safe and effective as the legally marketed predicate device. Per 21 CFR 860, safe means the probable benefit to health from use of the device outweighs any probable risk. And effective means that in a significant portion of the target population, the use of the device will provide clinically significant results. For the 510K submission, you must first identify a predicate device or devices that are legally marketed in the US via the 510K pathway or that have been marketed prior to 1976 and are thus exempt from the 510K process. For our existing 510K with the VL4 scanner, we use the Aperio ScanScope XT and Virtuoso IHC HER2 as predicate devices. So when is a 510K required? A 510K is required when the manufacturer wants to place a new device into commercial distribution, when there's a different intended use for a device already in commercial distribution, or when there's a significant change or modification to a device already in commercial distribution. Here the burden is on the manufacturer to decide if a modification has a significant impact, and this is typically documented in a formal regulatory assessment. So for our Omnyx manual read of the digital HER2 application on the Omnyx IDP system with the VL4 scanner, we submitted a 510K as it was a new device. For the Omnyx manual read of the digital HER2 application on the Omnyx IDP system with the VL120 scanner, we will be submitting a 510K as it represents a significant change to device already in distribution. So there are 3 different types of 510Ks. You have the traditional 510K, where you must demonstrate a new device is substantially equivalent to a commercially marketed device. This represents a new device with the same intended use, where the review time is approximately 90 days. And as I mentioned previously, Omnyx submitted a traditional 510K for the Omnyx IDP with the VL4 scanner and HER2. Next, there's a special 510K, which is for a modification to the manufacturer's previously cleared device. So it's the same device with the same intended use and has a review time of approximately 30 days. Finally, there's an abbreviated 510K, and that is actually not suggested as a pathway by the FDA, but here you show that your device is compliant by certifying it against recognized standards. Now to switch gears to the PMA process. So the PMA process typically starts with pre-submission meetings, which are used as tools to gather early FDA feedback. You then typically proceed to preclinical studies, which are typically used to justify your clinical study and include bench testing to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. You then proceed to an IDE or investigational device exemption, which is an application you submit to FDA that includes your clinical study protocol. FDA reviews and provides you with an exemption to perform your human clinical study without the need for any device clearance or approvals. You next proceed to the PMA submission, which FDA reviews, and there may be a need for the manufacturer to provide PMA amendments if FDA requests additional information. Once PMA approval is received, there is an annual report obligation and an obligation to prepare PMA supplements to inform FDA of changes to the PMA device that may impact the safety or effectiveness. So for the overall review process for PMAs, first there is an administrative and limited scientific review by FDA staff to determine completeness of the PMA. Then there is an in-depth scientific, regulatory, and quality system review by the appropriate FDA personnel. Then there's a review and recommendation by the appropriate advisory committee, and this is also called a panel review. And lastly, there are final deliberations, documentation, and notification of FDA's decision. For the PMA content, we must submit a summary of the submission information, a description of the device, including photos and drawings, reference to performance standards, reports regarding safety and effectiveness, all verification and validation protocols and executed protocols, preclinical study data, clinical study results, full manufacturing data and SOPs, the device's proposed labeling, the device's marketing history, and a disclosure of financial arrangements of the clinical investigators. Now, there are two commonly used types of PMAs. The first is the traditional PMA, where all material is submitted to FDA at once. This type of submission is generally used if the device is already commercially marketed in a country with established regulations. The second type, and the type Omnyx is pursuing, is the modular PMA. Now here the PMA content is broken down into modules. A PMA shell is first submitted to FDA prior to any module submissions, which outlines the plan for the submission. And the modules are reviewed by FDA as they are submitted. The benefit of this type of submission is that timely feedback can be received from FDA, and in our case, the fact that our clinical study has yet to be completed does not hold up submitting earlier modules. So FDA formally agreed to Omnyx's PMA shell on August 18th of last year, and our first module was submitted in November of last year, and the remaining 3 modules will be submitted this year and next. For the PMA post-approval requirements, they may include a requirement to conduct post-market surveillance studies to collect information about safety and effectiveness and provide this information to FDA. There also may be requirements to add additional warnings, hazards, or precautions based on new information about the device or a procedure, and there may be a requirement to keep device tracking records or submit periodic reports to FDA. And there is always the requirement to submit supplements for device design changes. Now, these PMA supplements are required to be submitted to FDA for any change to the device that may impact the safety or effectiveness. Now, this includes new indications for use, significant labeling changes, the use of a different manufacturing facility, changes to any sterilization procedures, or changes in the performance or design specifications, circuits, components, ingredients, principles of operation, or physical layout of the device. So to compare the PMA versus the 510K process, for the 510K, a clinical study is not always required. For a PMA, an FDA inspection for the sponsor and contract manufacturers is required, whereas with the 510K, this is not mandatory. For a PMA, a panel approval is required, whereas with the 510K, a FDA reviewer provides clearance. For a PMA, the review process is typically 2 to 3 years, whereas the 510K review time is typically 6 months to 1 year. For a PMA, changes made to the device or process that may impact safety or effectiveness must be reviewed by FDA, whereas with the 510K, these can be filed internally by following the FDA guidance document on changes to a 510K device. Now for a recap quiz to test your understanding of the material. So how many classes of U.S. medical devices are there? If you said 3, that's correct. What is the classification for the Omnyx IDP for HER2? Class 2. How many 510K submission types are there? If you said 3, you're correct. What mechanism is used for early feedback with the FDA? That would be the pre-submission process. Now, 5 examples of reasons for a PMA supplement were presented. Name 1. One could be new indications for use, significant labeling changes, a different manufacturing facility, sterilization procedure changes, or changes in the performance or design specs of the device.